Thanks, Ryan. Once again, my name is Nathan Wright. I work here at SmartBear. As Ryan mentioned, as the product marketing manager for Swagger and Swagger Hub. Um, and we'll just dive right in here. We're going to have a few different kind of phases of the webinar that we're going to run through. Just kind of do a quick level set. Really look at what Swagger is when we compare it to the OpenAPI specification or the OpenAPI initiative, how the two kind of came to be and how they relate to one another. We'll take a kind of a run through some of the open source tooling that's out there. So we'll look at things like the editor, the UI component. We'll talk about cogent and some of the annotation libraries that exist, some of the build plugins, that type of thing. There's a ton of stuff to cover in that regard. And really, we're not going to do like a ton of demos. We'll do a quick look at each one of these. But as Ryan mentioned, we have a ton of content for each of these. So we'll definitely pass along some links and that type of thing with the recording to kind of dig into each one of these more. And then we'll just quickly look at the Swagger Hub platform. I think it's a great way for us to kind of see how we can bring everything together to really speed up some different workflows of folks using the OpenAPI specification. So in terms of an agenda here. Just going to do, again, that quick introduction. We'll look at OAS and Swagger. We'll talk about the open source offerings, and then we'll dive into the Swagger Hub component. Not listed on here, but we're trying to leave maybe 30 minutes, maybe 20 minutes for questions at the end. So, feel free to post them into the chat. We'll try and keep an eye on that. There's a Q&A box, which is a little more manageable sometimes. So feel free to post them in there. And anything that we don't get to today or we don't have the opportunity to answer, we'll do our best to follow up after as well. Great. So let's go ahead and get started. So who are we? Why are we talking about Swagger Hub and Swagger in the first place? We here at SmartBear are a mid-size company. We provide tools for development, testing, operations teams, really to expedite the development workflow. We have a number of different open source tools, the two big ones in this case being Swagger, which we're obviously talking about today, and then our API testing solution, SoapUI. And it's interesting because we support these open source tools, these projects, these different kind of workflows, and then we have some professional versions of them as well. So Swagger Hub, Ready API or SoapUI Pro. We have this really nice relationship between fostering these open source groups and projects and communities, and then seeing that translate into some of these more kind of professional or platform-based solutions. Roughly 6.5 million users worldwide across all our products. On the right-hand side, we've got some of the big ones there. Swagger Hub, SoapUI, specific to API testing, but we've also got things like CBT, which are very useful for front-end or UI testing, relate very nicely to Test Complete up at the top there. Just a quick look at our product map. We've kind of broken this up into two channels. Up across the top, we have our UI tools, and that's from the initial kind of building of applications in something like Collaborator, which is a peer review kind of solution, through to testing tools, Test Left, Test Complete, CBT that I mentioned before. We recently acquired Zephyr, which was pretty exciting. So now we have this really nice way to start to collect together different test results and map those to things like JIRA instances. And across the bottom of the screen is probably what we're all kind of concerned with and focused on. That's our API lifecycle. So we have this Swagger Hub or Swagger tool section, but the goal here is that we generate something out of that we can then reuse across the rest of our kind of applications. So that specification feeds really nicely into our virtualization tools, feeds into our testing platforms, our load testing platforms. We've done some interesting things or seen some interesting things with BDD scripts and how that relates to API testing or development. So there's a lot of different connection points here as we look at kind of the entire life cycle. The nice thing about the specification, we have these tools that we support, but it's a standard format. We'll get into this more in just a second. It's kind of a standard way of defining a RESTful API. So it's very easy for us to essentially feed that into a ton of different things from our open source solutions as well as professional tools that exist. Great, so why are we, SmartBear, talking about OpenAPI? Why are we talking about Swagger in the first place? In 2010, around 2010, Wordnik, a company called Wordnik, created and open sourced the Swagger specification. And it was deliberately referenced as the Swagger specification here. Over the next 5 years, as kind of RESTful interfaces really started to grow and become the industry standard, as things were kind of being developed, there was a massive adoption of that Swagger specification, and with it, the development of a number of different tools. So we saw, I think the first one to come was the UI component, so rendering out API documentation, the editor, the cogent pieces. All of these kind of spawned out of the way that people were using and building these Swagger definitions, and then wanting to expose those to the different consumers or the different groups that would be kind of talking to the RESTful APIs. It was right in 2015 that SmartBear kind of saw the potential of the Swagger tool set and the specification, and they acquired, the company acquired all of the kind of tooling around that. As part of that, we donated the specification to the Open API initiative. Similar to what happened recently with the GraphQL kind of announcement from the Linux Foundation, it was donated to them, and they created this Open API initiative. And that spawned this kind of industry-wide kind of participation in the initiative. So there's some huge companies that have influence and kind of drive the direction that the Open API specification is going. And it was right at that time that it was donated that it was renamed from Swagger to the Open API spec. And that's an important piece because we kept that Swagger name and we thought that it was important to keep that. And now that ties to all of the tooling that we'll be talking about today. So Swagger is the tools and OpenAPI is the specification. That's what we have on the screen here. So it's something that causes some confusion, especially when we start talking about like Swagger 2.0 and the old version of the spec, and now we're on OAS 3.0. The definition is pretty consistent and its evolution is pretty consistent. It's just when we start to look at the name of the different components, that specification again is OpenAPI spec and the tools are Swagger. Cool. Great. So next thing I want to talk about here are the open source options. I really intend this to be kind of an introduction to the different ways that we can start to build and view and consume these Swagger documents or these Open API specifications with Swagger tools. So we'll step through them one by one. Each one has maybe a 2 to 5 minute demo of just how we can start to get into the different tool sets, and then hopefully, down the line, get you guys up and running with the different options here. Cool. So the first one I want to talk about is the Swagger editor. In my mind, we talk sometimes about these code first approaches, and we'll get into this a little later, where we have an existing API and we've written the code, we've spent months or years kind of building that out, and we see the benefit of Open API and the specification, but we don't necessarily want to rework our entire API. So we treat that as what we call a code first approach. Essentially, there's ways for us to annotate that code base and generate a specification off the back of that. When it comes to the editor, what we really see the value here is when we start to look at a design first approach. So instead of us creating code and spending time building out something, and as I'm sure everyone knows, a significant amount of time in some cases building something that we then get feedback on and have to go and do some rework and adjust, and there's kind of this iteration on it. We see this design first approach as a way for us to say, okay, let's create this specification. Let's create this contract or this document that tells us exactly what the API is going to ask for, what its request is going to look like, and then what it's going to respond with. We can then share that document, that contract, with our end users, our consumers, maybe with some of the other teams that we work with who are going to be building integrations. We can start to pass that along, and they can just give us feedback directly against that document. And we're able to take that feedback on, make adjustments very, very quickly. Because we haven't written any code yet, it's super easy for us to kind of treat that as kind of a working document. And we found that some people do this already with Word kind of documents or Slack messages, or we'll whiteboard something over the course of a few meetings. But really, this is a way for us to hold those things accountable. So for us to carry that through from that initial design phase all the way through to the kind of coding piece, as well as the deployment, and finally the documentation or consumption side of things as well. The editor is a great way to get started in building one of these definitions. Essentially what it has is a YAML editor on the left-hand side. That's where we plug in all of our request and response data. On the right-hand side, we have our end-user documentation. So we actually get a view of what this is going to look like when it hits production, when we're exposing this publicly and people are starting to consume it. Does it expose the right data? Does it include the right information? Is every different path got the right set of responses, whatever it might be. The other nice thing, and this is really useful for getting started, is that it gives live error reports. So if I make a mistake, YAML is kind of particular about our indentation. If I make a mistake while doing that, it'll actually just let me know, hey, this is the row that you need to go and adjust to kind of be compliant. The other nice thing that it has is an autocomplete functionality. So as we're building these things out, if I don't necessarily want to rewrite every time I have a new get method, I can start to just use these autocomplete kind of components to build out a lot of this stuff for us. The final piece is that this is extensible, it's customizable, it is open source. So it's something that people have pulled down and tweaked, built into their own kind of into their own ecosystems, or extended with company specific plugins, or style it to their own kind of requirements, whatever it might be. There's a ton of options out there for extending it beyond the base. So we'll just take a quick look at this here. Just going to open up an online version of this. There's a couple of ways that we can start to utilize the Swagger editor. Just put this down here. So there's a couple of different ways that we can start to use this. One is going to be just through the browser. I wouldn't highly recommend it, essentially because it's just a public instance of Swagger editor, really intended as kind of a demo space. It's very easy for us to download this and run it locally. We have like Docker instances. We have the kind of actual code base that you can pull down. So there's a lot of potential there. And there's also different hosted versions wrapped in something like Swagger Hub, or some of the other API gateways and builders that exist out there. So I just want to take a look at a couple of things in here that I mentioned before. One, we can see on the left-hand side that YAML document that I was talking about. It's defining for us right up here our path, our method. We've got some different metadata relating to that. So, some of the information that will get rendered out here on the right-hand side or in our documentation. And then we get down into the meat of it, where we have the request data, in this case, the parameters that we're listening for in those calls. And then we start to get together our collection of responses down at the bottom. So in this case, pet find by status is going to return either a 200 or a 400 here. Now, the nice thing is that when we open this on the right-hand side in our documentation, we can see that this actually looks like something that's a little more readable. So instead of me digging through this huge wall of text for this kind of path and method and particular response, we can just start to find it on the right-hand side and see exactly what's going on. One of the nice things that I'll point out here about OpenAPI is the ability to store definitions, and this will come in handy down the line, or we'll talk a little bit more about this down the line. But this definitions component means that we're not actually redefining over and over again something like a model or an object that we know is going to be standardized for this API. If we look at our documentation here, we can see that we have a JSON version of, I don't know why that just closed. We have a kind of a JSON version of that object. Here we go. And it's got some different data in here. It's got some structure to it. It's got some example values that we're going to be able to use. And all the way down at the bottom is where that's actually defined. So when we look here, we have this pet object that's stored for us to use across our API. We've got some things like a standardized response. Maybe we've got some different parameters that we want to have as standardized. All of this we can store in this definitions section and then create references to it. So this means, we could have 100, 1,000 different methods and calls that reference that pet object. And if I ever wanted to go and change it, there's only one place that I would have to do that, and that's here on the in the definitions section. So let's just say, we update this to Nathan's favorite dog. And we should find that now when we open that up again and take a look at that JSON, that's gone ahead and updated. And again, that's going to happen across the whole document. So it's super useful for us to say, okay, this is what our user object looks like, or this is what a pet object looks like, or a category. This is how we query for the category. and then for us to reference that across the entire application. A couple of the other things that I'll point out here, very easy to kind of see, that error reporting that I mentioned before. Let's say that we're building this out and we make a mistake in the syntax. Trying to make a real mistake here. There we go. So we can see that it's flagging for us that we've got a bad indentation in this section. And right up at the top, it's actually pointing us to where that's happening. So in our case, we could jump down to line 433. It will point us to, kind of the error that we're making, and then we could just jump right back in here and kind of resolve that. So it is kind of giving us some guidance as to, how we can make this essentially a valid specification and make it so it can be consumed by things like Swagger UI, which we'll talk about in just a second. The last thing that I'll mention here with the editor is the autocomplete feature. So if we start typing something like a new method in, and we hit Control Space, we have the ability to bring in these autocomplete chunks or pieces. In my case, let's go ahead and grab our get snippet. This has given us kind of a structure of some of the required values that I need to plug in here. So instead of me, having to remember and format this every single time, I can just start to build this out pretty quickly. And again, using that Control Space feature. And I do want to try this. This might not work in this version. But we should be able to build a reference using, so in some of the different packages that are provided through the open source options, when you create a reference here and you hit Control Space, it allows you to essentially pull from like a list. I'll try and demo this later in a different version of the editor, but it essentially pulls up a list of all the definitions, and we can just mouse through and pick the one we want. Kind of creates that definition for us. So again, just a nice way for us to kind of expedite the way that we generate and build these definition files. Cool. So next up on the list, we've talked about generating these OpenAPI specifications, generating these YAML files, and kind of building those from a design-first approach. How do we actually expose those to some of the different users or consumers that are going to be interested in working with our API? It's fine for us to hand over a YAML file, but it's a little messy. It's kind of requires you to kind of read through and understand like the structure of it and have a familiarity with the way that the document is built. And so what is available is something called Swagger UI. This essentially takes that YAML file and just converts it into consumer-facing documentation. It's very easily integrated with existing applications or new applications. There's a bunch of different ways, very similar to what we were talking about with the editor. There's a bunch of different ways that we can kind of pull this down, stand it up, either running, in our private, cloud instance or running locally, so I can start to see what, the document I'm generating looks like. We have like node packages, Docker kind of images for this as well. So there's a million different options for how we can start to leverage Swagger UI. We can even do things like pass in YAML files dynamically. It reads either JSON or YAML, so we can actually submit a new file to it as it's running on a server somewhere, and it can start to kind of render out different documentation as it's updated. So there's a lot of flexibility here, and as we see, kind of highly configurable beyond the base. The other nice thing that I like to mention is that it is interactive. This is something I think that a lot of people kind of come to Swagger UI to leverage. It's the ability for our end users to essentially start to try out calls against the application or against the API without necessarily writing something like a curl command or creating something like a script or an integration or a fetch function that's actually going to make that call. They can actually do it through a button click in the documentation itself. So we'll take a look at that in some of the links down at the bottom here. The first one is going to be pretty standard Swagger UI documentation, and this is actually something that we're hosting for our own API behind Swagger Hub. This is pretty much the standard standard view of what you get if you brought down like the Docker container and gave it a definition and started it up. We can see that it's giving us all the different methods. It's giving us the different paths. All of these are collected under different tags. So this is something that we can define in the YAML file, and then it's going to influence the way that this is exposed to our consumers. When we open any of these up, we'll find that we do have some example values and example data. It supports things like different languages. So if we had XML or JSON in our response type, it would render that out differently in the kind of view at the bottom here. And down at the bottom, we also expose the models underneath it. So we have something like that definition that we were talking about that's stored at the bottom of the YAML file. Let's just go ahead and grab one of these. We can see that we can actually pull that in, and that gets defined here as well. And this is kind of useful as a reference point. We see some people come to this and treat it as a reference point for when we start scripting or coding, the way that we need to define and start to build those objects and models in our actual API. It's very easy to understand that, as opposed to, let's say that we have a pair or 3 different models that are getting returned in this like owner or API call. Instead of like trying to read through those and kind of separate them out, we can just jump down to the bottom and see, okay, what does a position object look like, or what does a user look like? That's probably a little more common, right? Last thing that I'll mention here is the try it out now functionality. So when we open this up, we see on the right-hand side, we have this button. When we click that button, it turns some of these query parameters into fields. So this will allow us to, let's say, make a call against, here, let's try this one instead. Make a call against an actual API, and we'll actually see some data come back from the service and get rendered out. So let's just try here. This one. So let's say that we're going to do 20, execute. Now, down at the bottom, we can see that we're getting a response from the service. In this case, it didn't actually kind of call anything back, but it's also giving us a curl command. So if we did want to now bring this down into our command line and execute this locally, we can absolutely just copy paste that and start to do it from wherever we wanted to. So there's a lot of flexibility here. And again, this is something that makes it very easy for a consumer or a user to understand how to call this API without necessarily like building the code out themselves, or in some cases, the larger these or more complicated these calls get, especially when we get into authorization and some of the different headers. This curl generator is actually a huge time saver for people. The other thing that I wanted to point out with Swagger UI is that it is customizable. One of my favorite examples of this is actually, let's just grab the second link, through Marvel's API, and I was a little surprised that they provide an API at all. But when we take a look here, we can see that some of it looks kind of similar to what we were just looking at with the Swagger Hub API. All of these we can start to open up. We can get a good look at some of the definitions, some of the kind of different responses that can get returned here. And this is all built off the back again of that Swagger UI piece. And again, we can kind of see that try it out now functionality. So if we wanted to make a call and see the response come back, it's definitely possible for us to do that. I don't have an API key for this service, so I don't think that it's going to return any data to me. But I always think this is a pretty cool example, right, of something a little different than that standard Swagger UI view. So Ryan, any questions or anything coming in that we want to try and cover before we get into some of the coding options here? Excuse me.
Yeah, so we definitely, so we have a lot of questions coming in. A lot of them are very specific to different things you can do in the specification and doing the tools. And folks, we will do our best to try to answer as many of these as we can, but we will also go through and try to do a follow-up to this, maybe a blog post or something that kind of recaps some of these. But in a more general sense, we've got a couple questions on, I think we're showing some of the demo stuff in Swagger 2.0, just for the sake of, we know most people are using 2.0 still, which is, we totally understand. And so we want to be more, related for the use case that most people probably still have today. But we've just got some general questions in terms of, do you think companies should be looking at, adopting 3.0 or what should they be thinking about? Is it time to just migrate right away? Any insight on that?
Yeah, and it's a good question, right? The editor that's demoed online that we just ran through, its standard file is 2.0. It does support 3.0, I should say that out of the gate, and we'll definitely be demoing 3.0 through one of the other tools that we talk about later. When it comes to migrating, obviously there's a ton of functionality that got added to the 3.0 version of the spec. And some teams, when they're first like migrating or looking at using the OpenAPI specification, it's the option or it's the de facto now, right? It's the standard that people should go with. The catch is that a lot of the services out there don't necessarily consume it yet. Some of the gateways, some of the different, kind of documentation options that are out there just haven't caught up to the 3.0 version of the specification. So really, in my mind, it comes down to what already exists in your organization or your application pipeline. Does it support 3.0? Then I would highly recommend going that route. But if there's any point where we would have to like revert something back to 2.0, which is going to be a nightmare, in my mind, it makes sense to write those out initially in 2.0, and then down the line, there's ways to convert those up to the 3.0 version of the spec as the rest of the kind of pipeline or process catches up with being able to consume that. I don't have any great examples. We talked to so many different people, and it seems like every tool is a little bit different. A lot of the gateways have definitely started to support it now. But yeah, some of the other like deployment platforms and that kind of thing, they're still using 2.0.
Awesome. And I think we can jump back into the presentation here. Another thing we've gotten a lot of questions about, which I'll just kind of quickly clarify, is the different features in the tools when they'll be available. We've got some questions around more of a visual editor compared to the YAML editor, which we are showing here today. Right now, the YAML editor is what we offer in the open source and Swagger Hub, but there is some work being done to change that. We should be expecting the first visual editor in the open source hopefully by the end of this year, and then we're also expecting to bring that in Swagger Hub in early 2019. And so something to watch out for. But again, we'll try to follow up with some more detail on a lot of that stuff as well. I don't know if anything to add to that, Nathan. If not, we can jump back in.
No, the visual editor piece was actually a pretty cool story. There's one of the large tech companies out there. I don't want to say the name. Saw the opportunity. They were using OpenAPI internally to a very high degree, and they wanted to facilitate that for their business level kind of users, or they wanted to provide an easier way to start to build out those specifications, as someone mentioned, without necessarily getting into the YAML side of things. So they built it themselves, and it got rolled into the open source version. So I think it's going through testing, or it's in one of the branches that's out there now. But that should be consolidated into the editor pretty soon. So yeah, it's a great question. It's something that is, feedback we get all the time, or is given all the time, and definitely something that is kind of in the pipeline for the Swagger editor. So not too far out in our minds. Cool. So I forget what's up next here. Let's take a look. Here we go. Okay, this is a good one. So cogen, this is kind of interesting, and it talks to like the other side of these definitions. Like once we've generated them, once we built them, once we've gotten sign off from our different groups, and everyone's like, okay, that looks great. Now we can actually start to make use of it, right? Not just rendering it out in a pretty way. We can actually use it to kind of generate things like server stubs, which are very useful. So if we wanted to start to template out the way that we build our servers internally, our new APIs, we can actually feed this into the cogen component that we support, and it'll spit out like a kind of a standard option in a bunch of different languages. Client SDKs, this is another one that I see a lot of groups really engage with or start to use OpenAPI to really facilitate. A lot of people like have the ability or have the intent to define or build their APIs, the server side themselves, and I would probably do the same. But when it comes to generating these client SDKs, it's kind of a hassle to, every time we make a change to something in the API, to then go and tweak, potentially 3 or 4 or 5 or 10 different SDKs that we provide in different languages that are intended to integrate with our API. What we can actually do is feed a new version of the specification into the cogen side of things. It will generate those SDKs for us, and then we can just push them out to like a repository or something that's going to be a very quick way for our clients to then just pull those down and start to build integrations. So it works for both server and client side. 3.0 support, and I'm sure there's going to be some questions that come in about this. I will call 3.0 support ongoing. My understanding is that they rolled out support for the major languages that are utilized, so pretty much the Java-based languages, and I don't want to say which other one because I'll get called out for it. But those got rolled out initially. There are a bunch of branches that are being worked on to support 3.0 for some of the other languages. But it's really, I think, based on popularity. And this is a community-driven project, right? So we are, doing some work on our side and helping facilitate this, but there's a pretty large community that's also giving feedback and kind of implementing changes and kind of building this out as part of the open source community. So I don't really have a great demo of this. I think it's pretty dry to just have me kind of upload a spec to something and then spit out like a zip file of an SDK. I do just want to pull up the GitHub page for this. There's a ton of information here about how to get started with these components. So this is found either through Swagger.io, which is the site that we host and do our blogs and all that kind of stuff through, or this is right in the Swagger API Git repository. Cogent supports a number of different languages. As we move down here, we see we have the different clients, we have the different service stubs that can be generated, and there's a number of different ways that we can start to build these out. So there are some like, what would you call them, like a hosted version of this that you can start to send stuff up to and get SDKs down. I wouldn't really recommend it. It's not a scalable solution. The Docker one I think is very useful because, as we know, containers have all of the dependencies and everything we need to kind of run this in a consistent way. So it's a great way to do this dynamically. Like as part of our build pipeline or build process, we can spin up that container, hand off the new version of the specification that we've built, and then that can push that out, or all of the different SDKs or stubs, push that out to some different repositories and branches, depending on really what we want to do. So there's a ton of different options here. Again, we're not going to go through this in too much detail. The only other thing that I will point out is the different versions that are listed here. This is where you should keep an eye for the changes as they're rolled up. If we jumped into this branch, we would find that the list of supported languages is a little bit smaller. And really that's something that will get added as those languages come online. So yeah, a lot of different options is how we use this code generator piece. And something that, again, is kind of an ongoing project for us here. The last one that's kind of similar here, or in the same vein, I suppose, when we start talking about code, are build plugins and annotation libraries. We, as part of the Swagger project, have Maven and Gradle support, so there's some different build plugins on that side. There's a bunch of different annotation libraries out there. Something like Swashbuckle, I think, is for C languages, as well as like stuff for Node and Ruby and like all these other kind of standard formats for building APIs. And essentially what this allows us to do is drop in certain annotations, or if it's something like a Rails application, it's defined in a certain way, and our routes and our controllers and everything is stored in a very specific location. So we can actually like extract definitions through these different plugins. This allows us to build these OpenAPI specs at build or at runtime, and then hand them off either to like our documentation piece, or we can hand them off to our testing team to validate. Maybe they get sent up to some kind of external repository that's going to collate all these together. There's a million different options for when we look at doing this through our actual kind of code first approach. And this is something that we dig into a little bit more on a recent webinar that we ran. So in the follow-up recording, we'll send along a link to that webinar. It's, I think we posted it on the blog last week. If anyone wants to check that out. What we do there, we had like a Java API that we just made some changes to, dropped in the plugin, and then kind of built the application, showed some of the different ways that we can pull out the spec, and some of the different workflows that we could potentially facilitate there. So again, not something that I think we have too much time to get into today, but I highly recommend the webinar that, again, we ran a few weeks ago, where we dig into that in more detail and show off some examples of that working. Cool. So the last one that I'll mention here, and it's pretty easy to kind of run through in the browser, is Swagger Inspector. This is one that I think came out this year, maybe the end of last year, yeah, this year. And essentially it's a web-based, apparently, REST client. What it allows us to do is make calls out to an API, some kind of service. Recently we started supporting local calls as well, which was pretty neat. But we can take those calls that we make and we get responses to and very easily convert them into OpenAPI specifications. When we take a look at this, and it kind of ties into the next piece that we'll talk about, which is Swagger Hub. We can see that it's pretty straightforward for anyone that's used a RESTful client before, something like Postman or I don't know, what is that other one, Indigo or something like that. We have our kind of field right up at the top where we can grab, let's say, a URL. There we go. So Google Maps, to my understanding, doesn't have an open API specification that we can just pull down and start to use. I know that I potentially want to run some tests against this or kind of define some calls out to this as part of my API definition. Let's go ahead and make a GET request. It's telling me that I have to drop in my key, so let's go ahead and do that. There we go. There we go. Go ahead and send that again. So we get this nice response back. We can see that we're starting to collect together a history over here on the right-hand side. And let's say that we drop in some, different values and run some different calls. All of these are starting to get collected together. There we go. And let's go ahead and change this. So we know that it supports XML, obviously. Let's update this path to include JSON here. And just run that request again. And let's pick just another seeding here. And make that one last call. Great, so we can see that this is on the right-hand side, starting to pull all of these into this history field. Some of these, let's go ahead and grab maybe 2 of the JSON ones, 2 of the RESTful ones, or 2 of the XML ones. And we can go ahead and we could pin these. Like if we were doing this at scale, it's very easy for us to float successful ones up to the top using this pinned option. We can also add these to a collection. So if this is something that we know is going to take us not just 10 minutes sitting here in the browser, but is actually going to be like an afternoon or a couple days worth of calls that we're trying to drive through this thing, then we can start to collect those in together. And what this allows us to do is now migrate this over to Swagger Hub. And this is just a way for us to kind of show this off. We'll go ahead and create a definition. This one we will do in 3.0, so hopefully that answers the question of why we weren't doing that before. Let's just go ahead and log in here. Great. And just grab a couple of these. Again, make sure 3, create our definition. Awesome. So we'll find that this has now moved us over into the Swagger Hub tool. It's asking us to define what that API was, so let's call it Google Maps, I suppose. Maybe this isn't our official version. And let's drop this right into, I think I have room here. Perfect. So we can see that this has taken those 2 calls that we previously made, and it's stored them now in our service. If we open up our split view here, so if we took a look at the editor, we can see that it's kind of built out a lot of the work that we would have to do. So those query parameters that we were kind of working through, in this case, the key and the kind of address values, those have been pulled in for our GET requests, super useful. And then depending on what we kind of were getting back from the API, I believe that it defines, it's based on the content type. This response value also gets stored. So it's a very, very easy way, especially like if we have this huge API that we know is going to take us forever to build or redefine. It's very easy if we know exactly what we want to convert into one of these definitions and expose publicly or something like that. For us to go through these calls, kind of update some of these example values, like God forbid I put my key on here and we would just instead say API key. And now, all of that information is translated over into the right-hand side. So again, a very useful way for us to quickly build these out. All right. I will mention it does do 2.0 as well. So if we wanted to port this over into the previous version, again, as I mentioned before, if we have certain tools or workflows or something that don't support the new version, we can absolutely do it with the previous one as well. So yeah, definitely some flexibility on this side as well. Awesome. So I know we've got about 15 minutes left here. I'm just going to do, let's call it a quick segue into that tool that we were just looking at, just really kind of explain what it is that we've got there. Swagger Hub is our professional solution for developing and collaborating on open API specifications. Essentially, it brings together the editor, the UI component, the cogent piece, All of these different things we can kind of collate into a single platform, and we've just essentially built some kind of structure and guidance around that. Things like style guidelines. If I had a very specific way that I wanted to build APIs, or that I wanted my organization to build APIs, I can enforce those from a high level. We can start to organize users and teams. We can get feedback and comments very, very easily through the tool. And it also acts as a single source of truth for things like distributed services. So one of the cool things that we could do is we could store both 2.0 and a 3.0 version of the spec in parallel. We could keep those up to date with one another, and then depending on like our CI process, we could actually pull down either that 2.0 or 3.0 through the API in the back end. It makes it very, very easy for us to integrate this with a bunch of other stuff. And it, again, acts as a single source of truth. So all of our developers, our architects, all of our third parties or our stakeholders, they're all in the same bucket and working together, as opposed to everybody running these things locally on their own machines or desktops. I guess we'll just do a quick example, some of the functionality here in Swagger Hub. We can see, it should be pretty clear that editor on the right-hand side and our documentation view on the right. If we jump back to a slightly higher level, we can see that on the left-hand side is the organization, the team piece. We can see that we've got the concept of folders within here. So we can start to jump down and start to look at some of the different components that make up our different business units or our different projects, whatever it might be. So it's a really nice way for us to start to organize all of this information together, right? The other nice thing that I always like to point out is when we look at one of these definitions, let's grab that Darth Pets. We kind of know that we have those definitions that exist or could exist, like model definitions at the bottom of this file. And that's super useful for this individual API. But what if I know that in this case, a ship object is going to be defined across our entire organization? Like, I want this to be standardized for everybody. What we've actually done is we've kind of taken those definitions and stored them in something called a domain. This domain is a separate file that acts as essentially a library of reusable assets that we can always go and look back to. And it also means that if we had 10 or 100 different APIs that reference these objects, there's only one place that we have to go and make these updates. So it's just taking that concept of a definition, mapping that to an API. It's taking that a step further and kind of moving it to a slightly higher level. And there's a lot of flexibility here and a lot of other functionality beyond this. One of the cool things that we have is things like feedback. So, we talked about bringing in people before we start to code some of this stuff and kind of having a conversation around this. And we can actually do that within the tool, which is very useful. The last one that I'll mention here is the cogent capabilities. So, I talked about some of the options for like bringing it down either in like a container or running it locally, the cogent piece. When we open up one of these definitions, this is actually something that is built right into the tool. So when we look at our export options, client SDKs, we've got all of those available here. Server stubs, all of those are defined right here as well. And we also have integrations with things like GitHub and GitLab and Bitbucket, different gateways and API management platforms, so we can very easily kind of feed these out to all these different locations. Last thing that I'll show off here is the ability to convert specifications. So if I can dig up a 2.0 version of a spec here, this looks like a pretty good one. And I know that we want to, now our gateway is supporting 3.0 and I want to convert this over. We can actually just do that through click of a button, and it will generate a new version of the spec for us that we can open up, and all of that data has then been transferred over. So a very useful way for us to take an existing 2.0 version and just convert it over into that new version of the specification. Great. So that ran a little longer than I was kind of anticipating. Ryan, I don't know if there's any questions that we can kind of cover in the last 10 minutes here, any consistent themes or anything that we want to go through?
Yeah, so what we can do is we'll try to do our best to go through as many of these questions as we can here. There were a ton, and so I appreciate everyone for being engaged. I've done my best to try to hop in on these and try to run through as many of them as we can. I wanted to also let everyone know that we just launched a poll within the webinar. This is really a chance, if you're part of a team, part of an organization that is looking for solutions around Swagger, and you think I know we just quickly showed the Swagger Hub platform, but if you think this platform, even if you're going to use, just to as an evaluation or just to understand the capabilities, if you're interested in setting up a call or learning more about the tool or getting some additional information, let us know. We want to be as helpful as we can. We really built this tool to really fit the use cases of teams and organizations that are doing a lot with Swagger and OAS. And even if you're just early on or just evaluating some of the open source tools, we're happy to have a conversation to understand how this tool can fit into your workflow, really help standardize in the work that you're doing, whether you're looking to use Swagger Hub, in your browser or on our on-prem install, which we also have available. But I'll keep the poll open so everyone gets a chance to answer it there. But let's jump in, try to answer some of these questions that have come in. We have 10 minutes to try to get through as many of them as we can here. Nathan, one of the questions I saw, there was, and I don't know if you'll be able to speak this at a high level, but I think it might be useful. We get a lot of questions from people who are familiar with like Postman, who are kind of now looking at Swagger and understanding like the relationship between those tools, how are they different, how are they similar? Could you maybe just give a quick blurb on kind of just to provide some context for some people?
Yeah, so I see Swagger as kind of a parallel or something similar to the inspector component that we were talking about. Big differentiator there. Postman is going to be very focused on generating a Postman collection. Inspector is really built around the OpenAPI spec. So instead of something that's kind of proprietary, and I use Postman all the time. I think it's a great tool. If we were looking to work with OpenAPI and generate OpenAPI specifications, Inspector is a pretty solid option for us there. The one thing that Inspector won't do is validate. So we can't write a script or something that says, hey, did the response come back with a 200, or, did the response come back with the value that I anticipated? We're just going to collect the responses down. We do have things like SoapUI and Ready API, which are good options to actually validate the API calls that we're making. We can even, pull in one of those specifications and essentially use it as like a validation point. It tells us exactly what our response should look like. So if the API responds with that, things pass. If it doesn't, well, we get an error and it tells us exactly what the issue was. I believe that Postman supports pulling in OpenAPI specs now. Maybe someone will correct me if I'm wrong in that, but I'm not 100% sure if they can use them as a validation. I think it's just a way to like define all of the different calls that we could potentially make against an API.
Awesome. So we've had a lot of questions that are really specific people who are getting started with OAS 3.0. I just sent a link, I just want to let you know, in the chat, which goes to our documentation. We've got a great team here who spent a lot of time kind of learning the spec, getting up to speed in the spec, and then really documenting it from top down, similar to what we had with Swagger 2.0. We definitely recommend checking that out. So I just put that in the chat for people, since I know we're not going to be able to dive in and get to every one of these really specification related questions here. So just want to quickly look. How does a tool like Swagger Hub compare to someone? I had someone ask about the Apogee. Someone else asked about the AWS API Gateway. I mean, what's the relationship between that tool and a tool like Swagger Hub?
Yeah, so I like that question. We sit at a level higher than, I like to think we sit a level higher than a gateway or a management solution. We're not hosting the API. We're not, acting as like a practitioner for authorization values or anything like that. We're a design, we're a documentation tool, we're a collaboration tool, and we, again, act as kind of a source of truth for the things like gateways and management services. One of the cool things that we have in Swagger Hub here is a pretty clever way of versioning. So we can actually define like what is a default version. We can create a connection to, say, our AWS instance and say, okay, every time we make a change here, something's updated, republish this, resend this out to the gateway. But then when we have breaking changes coming down, we can update our default version to, let's say, this 1.5, and then issue that out to our gateway or to our management solution. Or probably we want to run both of these in parallel for a certain amount of time. So we would probably publish this, but not make it the default, or maybe we'd make this default, but not deprecate the previous one. So really, they're intended to work in parallel. And one of the conversations that I end up having with a lot of people and a lot of teams is that, we have like an architecture group, right, who defines things at a very high level. But then we get down to like development teams and these kind of business units, and they are given the freedom to use whatever gateway or whatever solution they really want. Whatever works best for them. It might be Kong, it might be AWS, it might be Apigee or whatever it is. You know, they have their own budget to kind of work with these tools. So for us to have this like centralized solution that potentially works with all of those, I think is pretty powerful. We can strip away a lot of the workflow issues that we run into by storing all of these definitions and these kind of API kind of values at a higher level. And again, just enforcing them from the top down as opposed to trying to collect everything at that gateway or that management level, especially when things get distributed or kind of different across teams. It becomes more of a kind of a management issue than a management process or benefit, I guess is how I would answer that question.
Awesome, that's great. Let's see here. Try to sort through these best we can. We did receive some questions around different support for generating code SDKs for 3.0 and Swagger Hub.
Yeah.
I think that's something we can include as part of the follow-up. So I don't want people to, it's just to read through a whole list here. So we can definitely send those out to folks. We got a lot of questions from people who are already using like the open source editor and UI today. And they're just wondering about like, what's the use case for moving like from that workflow that they might already have established into something like Swagger Hub today? Is there specific issues that they may run into or things that there's benefit from, or is it just moving to a different tool just for the sake of doing it?
Yeah. So in my mind, it's a way to support using Open API, using those open source tools at scale. As soon as we have like 2 users or 3 users, let's say, and as soon as we have a couple of teams that are starting to use these specifications and share data, maybe want to get feedback from one another, we end up having to build or define a process that we then have to maintain, and that becomes as much of kind of a part of the project or something that we have to support as the actual API or the application itself. So for us to be able to kind of work within a single platform, be it a kind of a SaaS kind of version like we've been working with here, or whether it's something that's deployed on premise, for us to have the ability to kind of work together in that space, I think it's pretty powerful. And it's really a transition we see teams make. We have a ton of people who get started and see great success, huge success with the open source options, and then end up kind of graduating or growing into one of these kind of Swagger Hub plans. So it's very common. Ryan, it's like we see people come from open source. They, start with a team plan and get a couple of people in Swagger Hub, and then, they have a couple other teams who see what they're doing and they get interested. And okay, now we have, an organization that's in here, and we have to think about, expanding to like an enterprise size or deploying something on premise. So there's a lot of ways that we can kind of grow into a solution like Swagger Hub. But really it all comes down at the very kind of bottom layer to the Open API spec and to the tooling around that.
Fantastic. I think we have time for at least one more question here. The question that came in that I pulled and I told someone I would ask you about earlier in the presentation is around kind of publishing and sharing the documentation. So it sounds like they're working with, maybe they have the Swagger UI set up. I know you showed the Marvel example. I know there's different use cases if you're using Swagger Hub, different ways you can share it from there. I mean, what are some of the ways you see people actually, publishing the UI and making it kind of consumable to people?
Yeah. So there's a ton of different options, right? Swagger UI is great and it's built for Open API specs. There's other options out there like Slate and Spectacle and some of the other like documentation views. Some of the things like readme.io, support bringing in Open API specifications. We actually recently put together like a little blog post on building one from scratch. So essentially taking the Swagger UI component, taking the node package that exists there, and using it as a way and feeding in data dynamically to it. I can't think of the address here. But yeah, I would highly recommend it. It's something that we put on the blog recently. It's essentially a very lightweight React app that's designed to make calls out to an external resource, be it Swagger Hub or something else, based on user input. So we show a list of all our API definitions. We can feed those into a centralized component. We can layer in things like Markdown, and we can kind of wrap it in custom styling and do whatever we want with it. And that's just one option. It's really because it comes in this like standardized format, and because it's in something that is very easily consumable. Like when we start looking at the way we can pull this down in JSON, there's so many options for how we start to render this out. And Swagger UI is a great option. Again, it's tied very closely to the specification and to the Swagger project. But it doesn't have to be that. And we've seen people like Kong has an API gateway. They also have kind of a documentation piece where they can start to expose Swagger specs through that. That's another good one that I've kind of played around with and I think is pretty neat. So there's a lot of flexibility here with how we actually start to render out the docs.
Awesome. All right. Well, I think we're right up at the end of the session here. I want to be respectful of folks' time. So I think we're going to have to wrap up now. We appreciate everyone taking the time out of your schedule. Like I said, we're going to take the time to go through some of the questions here and answer as many of them as we can on the blog as a follow-up session. As I wrap up here, we do still have the poll live in the webinar. If you are interested in learning more about Swagger, how to understand how it can work for your team, now would be a great time to let us know. And if not, at the very least, we hope you walked away from today's session really getting a better understanding of the Swagger tooling ecosystem, the open API specification, and really how it can fit in with your API development. We know this was kind of an introductory level a session, and so for folks who are interested in learning more, if you go to swagger.io, which is the website where we have all of our resources, you'll see a resource tab at the top of that site. You can take deep dives into any of our webinars and trainings. You can find documentation. You can find tutorials. We're working hard on trying to provide the best education out there around the Open API specification, and we hope this was useful for everyone. So at this time, we're going to have to wrap up. We appreciate everyone taking the time. And Nathan, thanks again for a great presentation.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks everyone for watching.